Welcome back to Spiritual Judo for Sustainable Jesus. And now we're talking about and looking at the history of smallpox, and we've arrived at the North American colonies, England's North American colonies in 1706. So just before, an Italian physician wrote a letter about the Turkish pustule, fun name there, pustule technique, apparently derived from an earlier Chinese technique, and related African techniques. Now, in this case, we've got the report that Cotton Mather, historians have identified that Cotton Mather, this famous, I guess he was a minister in the New England area, that he had a slave. You know, he's the name of I went to Harvard, right? And so one of the dorms there is named Mather House. It's the, the upper class dorms, the non-freshman dorms. So Cotton Mather had a slave named Onesimus. And he knew a variolation technique from Africa. So just before, as Lady Mary Montagu was in visiting Turkey, or just before, a few years before, and this Italian doctor, this was already occurring in the North American colonies. So Cotton Mather had a slave who knew about variolation from Africa, but as he started to think about it and talk about it, there was first of all the religious logic. Talk about, all right, give the new atheists a taste of this, and they'll have a field day. So they were opposed to treatment because it was God's will, right? It was God's will that people were dying from smallpox. There was also suspicion of African culture, so that if it wasn't God's will that people were dying of the disease, then the African culture would, with its primitive nature, would kill Christians or kill people. And then, of course, the whole underlying guilt thing with concerns about slave conspiracy and revolt, or rather, guilt or fear and that kind of complex. But in 1714, Mather actually read the letter by the Italian physician Timoni, published by the Royal Society in their journal, about the Turkish technique. And Mather had an associate named Z. Boylston, a surgeon, another famous name from that college, the same college and university. And with the surgeon Boylston's support, Boylston was able to develop the technique, and by 1724 established his reputation and traveled to London to make a report about his apparent success. Right, so that is smallpox. And it goes on from there. With Edward Jenner then in 1798, and I think it's the Balmis expedition and so on. So in our survey then, Louis Pasteur then is a famous name that comes up. In the mid-1800s then, as there were anthrax bacteria were identified, right, because now we're actually getting into the whole the whole sequence of the progress of science. So I guess it's good for us to know, let me jump down here just a little bit. Robert Hooke was an early user of the microscope, and got quite famous early on for his microscopic work, his biological work. He published, I think it was the first popular science book, Micrographia, in 1665. Now, in terms of single-celled microorganisms, Antony von Leeuwenhoek observed them in, around that time, actually, 1670s. right? So he observed actual microorganisms, bacteria, and his story is fascinating. Originally he was no scientist, right? He was a cloth merchant, and he innovated a lens-making technique that gave him a special advantage. And that whole story is interesting because he didn't share the technique with anybody. And it was only discovered actually in like the 1950s or so. So, and then I didn't put it down here, but Schwann and Schleiden, these two Germans in the 1838 or so, they were, Schwann or Schleiden, one made the observation that plant cells their nuclei seem to split off into new cells. And then the other guy, Schwann or Schleiden, observed that, noted as they were talking over dinner, that he also had noticed that kind of process in animal cells. So they developed then the cell theory, right, to finally make the statement and define a fundamental process in life, right, that defines life. Life exists in terms of cells, and it's cells that come from cells. Oh, here comes my boy. Okay, so finish this segment. See you later.